Okay, we've covered the topic of workers' compensation in depth with our friends over at Barbas Law, but there's always much more to learn. Today, Catherine Stone is back with details on calculating how much is paid to you. Good morning. Welcome back.
Good morning to you, too.
I love that you kind of embrace it and say, you know what, I know that we talk about this a lot.
I know that we do, but as I was preparing for the show, I was like, listen, every employer in the state of Florida is required by law, if you have 5 or more employees, there's a few exceptions, I won't get into that, but if you have 5 or more employees, you have to have workers' comp insurance. So that's a lot of employers in the state of Florida.
And
that's a lot of employees that may have accidents. And so I want to make sure they know what the system provides for them.
Okay, so let's talk about that. And because that is kind of the big question, is that if something happens, how much can we get? Is it 100%?
Aside from the medical treatment, as always, how am I going to make money to pay my bills is always the question. And so the biggest question, and I just had this come up, which again, you know, I love to use my real world experiences. Client came in to me and said, I don't understand how much they're paying me. It's so little. And so I had to sit down and explain that you will hear the term average weekly wage. And that is calculated with the 13 weeks prior to the date of the accident. And so
no exceptions.
No exceptions.
That's the cutoff.
That is the 13 weeks.
Okay.
That's all you get. So if unfortunately you were kind of in a downturn, you know, let's maybe say you were, you know, in the restaurant industry or a service type industry, and it was a downturn for you, unfortunately, there's no way to make that back up.
And 13 weeks as of when the actual accident or the incident happens?
So actually the week of the accident is not included in the calculation.
Okay.
They start the week prior and they go back 13 weeks. Now, some clients may not have worked a full 13 weeks. I have several clients that just started a new job and unfortunately they had an accident. So there's all these different ways that we deal with that by using a similar employee. And so I had a client who had not worked substantially the whole of the 13 weeks. The employer was using a similar employee, but then come to find out that employee wasn't doing all the things that my client was doing, and my client was actually being paid differently. And so we ended up having to use his contract of hire, which gave him a higher average weekly wage. So there's all kinds of different ways that we look at average weekly wage, and that's part of one of the first things that we do when a case comes into our office is we sit down and we make sure that the money earnings and the average weekly wage, there's a form, it's called an average weekly wage form, we make sure that those numbers are correct. And if anything looks funny about those forms, we make sure and we gather the information we need to look at that.
We have a little less than a minute left. I know you wanted to mention a lot of people have side jobs or kind of another job as well.
Right, yes. So this client that came in, he had a part-time job. So your part-time job, if you had it within that 13 weeks and earned wages, we can get that included into your average weekly wage to help boost how much work comp has to pay you.
Okay. So make sure that they know.
Exactly. And that, again, that's why it's so important to sit down with a lawyer when you've had an accident to make sure
and
that.
How soon do you recommend that as we kind of wrap things up?
I mean, as sooner rather than later, because you know, if you're not being paid at the correct rate, we can get them to go back and pay you the past monies, but wouldn't you want that? Wouldn't you want that money when you deserve it?
Well, again, we love that you're so passionate about educating people. There is a lot to dive into. We look forward to having you back next week. Thank you so much. And again, if you have any other questions, she always talks about how she really wants you to call. She's very open to answering your questions, 1-800-BARBAS-LAW, or go to barbaslaw.com as well /know your rights.